The deep state delivers a major victory to financial criminals. Martin North, John Adams, in the interest of the people. Hello, John. We're back again.
Hi, Martin. How are you today?
Yeah, I'm pretty good. Yourself?
I am deep in the burrows here in Wollongong, coming up with my new set of tactics to um, free Australia from financial crime. Today's shows, I think, is important, Martin, is because yesterday we had the first public hearing of the ASIC inquiry, and ASIC was quite adamant that there is no problem. They are an effective law enforcement agency. Everything is hunky dory. And this could not be better news for financial criminals because I think a lot of financial criminals in Australia know that ASIC is very weak in what they do. And obviously, my public analysis showed that they are an agency in decline. And so, if you're thinking of engaging in organized fraud, yesterday was music to your ears because the deep state basically is saying they are not going to admit that they're making any mistakes. There's nothing to improve because everything is fine, and that Parliament and John Adams and Martin North can get stuffed.
Exactly. And, it was the same old, really, wasn't it, with regard to ASIC saying nothing to see here, everything's fine, we're doing our job, we're a great regulator, all the processes and systems are, going in the right direction, et cetera, et cetera. And now the inquiry itself was, of course, I think call it the hearing was relatively short notice, but there were only a few senators actually on, and it was all done over the video conferencing systems, and that probably didn't help. But I didn't feel necessarily that they pushed ASIC particularly far. Now, maybe that's part of an overall strategy that they've got in terms of actually, doing the long rather than the short journey. But I think there were some important points that they didn't press home when they should have, bearing in mind that the early interim report had come out and was very, very critical of ASIC and its conduct.
Yes, yes. I would agree with you that the senators had a softly approach, and perhaps that they're being diplomatic because the interim report, Martin, was basically saying that there's a lot of information that the inquiry wants, and ASIC is not forthcoming. So the report was maybe they're playing good cop, bad cop, and saying, well, we're going to smash you with this report, but we're going to be polite to your face. Well, the great thing about you and I, Martin, is that our job is to provide that critical analysis, but also to hold ASIC's feet to the fire. So the points that the senator should have made, you and I are here to make them today. And today, Martin, we're going to get into. I think we're going to show two clips about what took place in the hearing yesterday, and we're going to make some comments about those. But before we get into those specific clips, I thought it'd just be worthwhile to call out a couple of the issues for our audience, just so people can get a sense as to where at least our thinking is. So the first one is kind of like you said. So of all the pressing problems facing Australia, financial crime and financial scams is a massive problem. ASIC is one of the biggest policy dilemmas facing Canberra because it's an agency that's been going backwards for 15 years and clearly not performing. And how many senators showed up for the first hearing? Only three. And the third senator just jumped on at the very end to talk about issues related to PricewaterhouseCoopers and that scandal. But there was only really two senators there for the first session, which was 90 minutes. And you would have thought that there'd be a lot more interest from other members of the Senate to hold ASIC's feet to the fire. So can I say, Martin, that if there are listeners out there who are supporters of the Greens or One Nation or other members of the coalition, and even to some extent other members of the of Labor or in terms of the crossbench, I mean, I think there's a lot to be desired. And if this is a according topic for you, dare I say, I think it's incumbent on all members of the public to apply pressure to all senators and say, stop getting distracted on the minor issues that the parliament's looking at and actually start to focus on the big entrenched problems which have been festering for a decade and getting worse, because these are the problems we need to fix if we're going to turn the country around.
Well, I think that's a very important point, John, because clearly there are very able senators from all parties who should be engaging around this particular issue. And like you say, there are many other issues, whizzing around everybody's head at the moment. But this is a really critical one because it goes to the heart of the way the financial system runs in Australia, and whether, in fact, investors and ordinary people can trust the way the financial system works. And at the moment, on the current outing from ASIC, you'd have to say you would have to be very, very careful to engage in financial services at all in Australia because the regulatory processes are not working.
Yes, and that's a great point, Martin, because ASIC had a clear strategy with this whole inquiry, and that is to deny everything and say everything is fine. So we're going to, as we get into the first clip, and the first clip is going to be covering the chairman's speech, which goes for about 6 minutes, and you're going to hear how great they are, how wrong you and I are, and how wrong Parliament is in our thinking of them, and how effective they are in terms of being a law enforcement agency. So it's clear for me that they have a deliberate political strategy, which is to deny and basically ignore. It's kind of like a Monty Python sort of skit. I mean, and obviously, Martin, you're back in England. But remember that Monty Python skit where the guy loses a leg and an arm, it's only a flesh wound, everything's fine. Well, we have, their own data saying they're getting worse. We have the senators upset with ASIC. We have major financial scams all over the place. And these submissions that the inquiry has received point to major failings in the law enforcement regime. And they just say everything's great. I mean, I couldn't. There could not be a more out of touch regulator than what we saw from Joseph Longo yesterday before the inquiry.
Yeah, and it's worth saying, of course, that the inquiry asked for updated information relating to the number of investigations, et cetera, and they said, well, we'll see what we can do. We'll have some data later in the year. But of course, it's just worth underscoring, John, your analysis was absolutely based on ASIC's data. And, the Treasury has reconfirmed that your analysis is correct. So that's why this is such a stark contrast between reality, the data, and the way that ASIC is choosing to present it.
Yes. And one of the things that you and I have done, I think, effectively well over the last few years, Martin, is that particularly in the economic sphere, when we've taken on the Reserve Bank of Australia or Treasury or Kokulas or others, we basically look at the data and we say whether the data is accurate or not accurate, and then we obviously point out all the shortcomings. So that's what we did again in this context, and they're not willing to even concede that their own data is showing a disturbing trend, which is just completely baffling that, people who are being paid, the chairman's being paid about anywhere between $600,000 to $800,000 a year, and he can't even admit that his own data is saying they're getting worse, which is just, why would you allow a bureaucrat to be paid so much to basically deny the obvious? It's just a waste of public money. But the other thing I just wanted to call out, Martin, is ASIC is being distracted by a whole host of irrelevant things, and they're trumping these things to say, aren't we great? And so we covered this last year, this issue of greenwashing, which is statements by investment managers and other people in the financial system who are promoting so-called green credentials. And a number of these statements are exaggerated. So obviously there's a whole campaign around net zero. And so there's a lot of people, particularly financial managers who are allocating capital, who are saying that we are allocating capital in such a way that we are contributing to the net zero campaign. And look how green we are, and look how climate conscious we are. And most of these statements, I wouldn't say most, but a lot of statements are not supported by evidence, and they're just coming up with BS. And so ASIC is going after this, and a lot of their enforcement activity is around this greenwashing issue. But can I say, Martin, is when you think of investor harm, financial harm, when you start to think about the horror stories that people are going through. Greenwashing doesn't actually hurt real people. What hurts real people is fraud. And we've seen so many examples of dishonesty and fraud, and they can be small scale, they can be large scale. But if ASIC is thinking, well, if they're going to investigate crimes and they're going to actually take action in the courts or even put people in jail, where should they be focusing on? I don't even think greenwashing should be on the agenda for ASIC because I don't think they've fully come to terms with being able to detect and go after major fraud. I mean, they haven't been effective in doing that, and I think that's the bread and butter because once fraud happens on a mass scale, and that fraud is exposed, that's when people's lives are destroyed, and a lot of these people are left languishing, and no one's there to pick up the pieces for them. And part of the problem with ASIC is whether it's the Wolf of Wall that was on Four Corners last year, or the Sterling First scandal that happened a couple of years ago, or in terms of some of the other things that have been happening across the country, the big ticket, what I would consider the big ticket items in terms of fighting white collar crime, ASIC seems not to be focused on these issues. They're focused on trivial issues, which is perhaps for the C-suite elite seem to be important. But for people like you and me on ground zero, it's like there's some relevance. I'm not saying there's no relevance, but it's not the bread and butter of what ASIC should be doing.
No, well, it's perhaps an easier target than the real, fundamental issues that we're touching on. And it's interesting because Dixon Advisory came up in the discussions in the hearing. And of course, that's a recent example of quite a significant failure, with another example where investors potentially could be losing quite a lot of money. This is another example, again, after Sterling and others, where organizations really haven't done the right thing, and yet ASIC has not been active enough, open enough, objective enough, and forward-looking enough to really start tackling those issues. So wherever you look, there are these big casualties around the place, and the greenwashing is important, but it's by no means the most fundamental issue at hand.
Yes. Look, very interesting you should mention Dixon Advisory because when Senator Bragg raised that, what came out in that discussion was that the losses to investors is $368 million. The corporation received a fine of $7 million. And when Senator Bragg asked about criminal prosecutions, the response was, it is highly unlikely that anyone's going to go to jail over that issue. And Senator Bragg wanted to highlight this as a key failure of ASIC. And the only thing ASIC could say is, well, Senator, if you have evidence that would assist us in putting people in jail, come forward with that evidence. I'm thinking, well, hang on, isn't that your job? Isn't that your job to go and dig for the information, the evidence? I mean, I had to go dig 9 months to get the evidence to get ASIC to open up an investigation. And dare I say, had I not done that, they would have told me to go jump. And so here you have a massive failure, and ASIC says, well, we can't find enough evidence to put bad people away, even though the losses are colossal, which is just, again, look, their response and their attitude to this thing just was, I think it rubbed Senator Bragg the wrong way. And can I say this, Martin, is I think there's a big difference here. If it was their money compared to the public's money, I think their entire approach to these matters would be wholesale different. And that, I think, is a huge problem.
No, I think that's right. And it's interesting because Bragg was recently on the radio saying that this is a really, really important inquiry, once in a generation, et cetera, et cetera. And he was also expressing in the discussions the desire to really make a difference, because some inquiries perhaps don't. So there's an interesting alignment question here between intent and action at the moment, I think.
Yes, yes. So we're just going to show a quote on the screen, Martin, and this is a quote that comes from Senator Bragg. He actually gave an interview after the hearing, and obviously ABC Radio wanted to get his perspective, and he basically said of ASIC, quote, "I think they see this as a run-of-the-mill inquiry, whereas the Parliament, I think, sees this as perhaps once in a 10-year shot of getting a much better law enforcement mechanism in Australia. And so we will pursue these matters with ASIC. We have the unanimous support of the Senate. So you'll have to watch this space and see what ASIC do next." And so, I mean, you and I have made this point on this show that the next opportunity to potentially examine these issues with ASIC may not happen for the rest of the decade. And I think Senator Bragg has seized our thinking on this, and it really is an opportunity to see if we can actually drive meaningful reform. Because if we don't, I think we're going to see continued horror stories over the next 2-3 years as more and more scandals continue to be revealed and people realize that they thought they had money, but in fact, the money or the assets that they had didn't exist, and they are going to realize that their entire world is going to be thrown upside down.
Yeah, and there is a long history here, isn't there, of people losing their shirts and being misled, and in some cases, almost criminal behavior, you'd say, although, other people might disagree. But this is a really, really important process that we're involved in. I'm good to see that Bragg is recognizing the once in a generation nature of the inquiry here. It's just a pity that ASIC doesn't.
Yes. So Martin, I thought we would start in going through our first clip. So the first clip is Chairman Longo providing his opening statement, which goes for about 6 minutes. And while the clip is long, I think there's a lot to take away from what he says, but also how he says it. And you and I have been covering a lot of information about financial crime, about ASIC, about its performance. And so our viewers would be more educated on this issue compared to the general public. And so for those who are watching, I want you to focus on what he says, how he says it, versus all the information that Martin and I have delivered to the public through this channel over the last 9 months.
I'm pleased to have the opportunity to appear before the committee today. Before I begin my substantive remarks, however, I want to say this. Clearly, there are a number of positions which the Chair has taken in Parliament and that this committee has taken in its interim report, which are highly critical of ASIC. As its Chair, I feel duty-bound to respond on ASIC's behalf. I take ASIC's responsibility to be accountable and transparent very seriously. I'm sure you would not expect anything less of me. With that in mind, I wish to make clear that I reject the interim report's findings and the statements made in Parliament about ASIC's insider trading and general enforcement record. Taking each in turn, let me first say that ASIC unequivocally rejects any assertion of an intent to obfuscate or obstruct the committee. There is absolutely no evidence to support that assertion, nor is there any evidence to support the assertion that ASIC attempted to undermine and influence the process of the inquiry from the outset. ASIC is accountable to Parliament. This inquiry is an important part of ASIC's oversight. ASIC is taking an open, constructive and cooperative approach to this inquiry. We have provided a detailed submission to the inquiry which sets out our approach to investigations and enforcement. As the interim report itself notes, we have answered 104 out of 109 questions on notice relating to individual matters to assist the committee. We have not refused to answer questions on these individual matters. However, ASIC is a law enforcement agency. And as a law enforcement agency, like the AFP, ATO and other agencies, there are limits on what documents we can share. We need to ensure that our current and future work is not adversely impacted through public disclosure of our investigative files, transcripts, and our legal advice. Information about closed investigations can still prejudice ASIC's related and future investigations. It can disclose ASIC's methods and legal advice and also adversely impact people who have assisted ASIC and, of course, unfairly prejudice people who've been the subject of our investigations. As we've said in our letters to the committee, we wish to be open and transparent with the inquiry, but we need to raise objections to requests for evidence where it is necessary to do so to protect the rule of law and ASIC's future effectiveness as a law enforcement agency. This is consistent with the long-standing practice of parliamentary committees in Australia. In the meantime, we are now giving further consideration to the orders made by the Senate and the committee's interim report. Secondly, in relation to the assertion that if you engage in insider trading in Australia, you will get away with it, all the evidence proves this could not be less accurate. It is incorrect. ASIC has a strong and consistent record in insider trading convictions. We provided statistics about our insider trading inquiries, investigations and outcomes in response to questions on notice, and I once again emphasise them here. Over the past 3 years, we've commenced 33 insider trading investigations and have laid 29 charges against 9 individuals in relation to this conduct. We've obtained 6 criminal convictions. Most recently, the former CFO of Biggin has been charged with insider trading. In March, a former director of Tesla Motors Australia was sentenced for insider trading. And I'm sure many of you will recall the high-profile ASIC, DPP and AFP insider trading investigation and prosecution that was featured on ABC's Australian Story in September 2021 and gained worldwide prominence. In that case, 2 people were sentenced to jail terms of over 7 years and over 3 years in the Victorian Supreme Court for their roles in Australia's largest insider trading scheme, totalling $7 million. In case the numbers do not make it clear, let me say it plainly. Insider trading is an important priority for ASIC. We know it can undermine market integrity and public confidence in our financial markets. It has long been recognised as conduct that can be challenging to detect and pursue. Our insider trading detection technology is both award-winning and world-class. Deciding whether to prosecute insider trading is a serious matter, which requires us to determine whether there is sufficient evidence to substantiate a criminal legal action. Nor is it our decision alone. Once we refer a brief of evidence to the Commonwealth Director of Public Prosecutions, the CDPP looks independently at the evidence in deciding whether to bring criminal charges. Third, we entirely reject assertions that ASIC is a weak corporate regulator. On the contrary, we have been and continue to be an active and effective litigator. Over the past 3 years, we've commenced over 125 criminal actions, resulting in 92 criminal convictions and 39 custodial sentences. Our criminal actions have also resulted in well over $2 million in fines. In the same period, we've commenced close to 200 civil actions, resulting in over 130 successful civil claims and more than $500 million in penalties imposed by the courts. Indeed, it would be hard to find a day when ASIC is not in a state or federal court somewhere in the country. I've said before, I'm committed to making ASIC an ambitious and confident regulator. Enforcement is at the heart of what we do. Together with the regulatory and supervisory work we do, it supports Australia's strong financial system and markets.
And the bottom line is, when you've listened to it, well, nothing to see here, you know. They're doing a perfect job. They obviously are trying still to close the inquiry down and, you know, basically say, well, everyone's wasting their time. And yet, you know, and I know, John, that this is the most critical issue in play at the moment with regard to ASIC and the way it's behaving.
Martin, I have to say, I thought this clip was extraordinary for a couple of reasons. The first issue is that I've like, because you've got to listen to this carefully. The first thing that the chairman said is there is no evidence that ASIC attempted to undermine or influence the inquiry from the outset. Now, here's one of the critical points, and we covered this in the last show, Martin. The reason why there's no evidence, as the chairman says, is because he is hiding the evidence. Senator Bragg has been continually pursuing this matter since November last year, and you and I did a show about this called deep state banana republic corruption because Senator Bragg said you tried to talk to someone in the Senate before the vote on the 27th of October. So show us the communications, show us the email, show us the text message. Who did you try to communicate with and what did you say? So this battle has been going on for 9 months, and ASIC still says we're not going to tell you anything about our communications because of confidentiality and all the other BS that happens. Now, in the interim report, I think this is paragraph 1.31. The report says that it is up to a senator to refer this issue to the Privileges Committee. And when you look at Senator Bragg's press statement from this week, he said he is going to send Joseph Longo to the Privileges Committee for potential contempt. And so the reason why Senator Bragg is upset with this whole situation is they're hiding. And the fact that they are hiding, because when you think about, Martin, the concept of the deep state, what is the deep state? It is bureaucrats who are hiding in the shadows, doing things that the public can't see. And those things, those activities are there to attempt to manipulate the political or the democratic institutions of the country and to ensure that the country goes in a particular direction where the bureaucrats want to go. I mean, that's what the CIA, the FBI, the IRS, and other elements of the American government do. And that's why they call it the deep state in terms of the United States. So we have a secret network of bureaucrats in Australia who are trying to maneuver and do things behind the scenes to manipulate the political system so that the country goes in the direction they want to go in. And so in a democracy, we the people want Australia to go in a particular direction, and that includes the financial system. And yet, rather than actually engaging with the public about the issues at hand, they attempted to manipulate Parliament. And then when the senator says, okay, show us, and when they said we never did attempt to manipulate Parliament, well, show us the communication so we can actually see what you did on that day. And they said, we're not going to show you. And so they have the gall to say, there's no evidence we tried to manipulate anyone. And the reason why there's no evidence is because they're hiding all of their communications.
Absolutely right. And, I've said several times, I'll say it again, John, ASIC is probably the most extreme example, but we suspect other institutions within the bureaucracy also are using similar tactics and processes to effectively avoid scrutiny and to influence the way that decisions are taken within the parliamentary environment. We can't prove it, but we suspect it's going on. And so this goes to the heart of government and how government works in practice rather than in theory.
Yes, I mean, the only thing I'll say to that, Martin, is that in this particular case, I do agree with you. I think ASIC is the worst of the worst. But we do know that there was communication because ASIC has admitted there was communication with Parliament before the vote. But to who and what was said and how it was said, that remains a mystery. Like John F. Kennedy said that the best disinfectant is sunlight. And so if ASIC wants to build trust with Parliament and build trust with the public, just publish everything so we can see what actually happened. But this continual campaign to hide everything is just going to continue to raise suspicions among the committee members within the Senate, but also within the public, people like you and I who are paying close attention to this, because there's no reason why the public should trust ASIC because they have a horrendous track record. And this type of behavior and this attitude is going to continue to build mistrust between the financial police and the public.
Spot on, John. Absolutely. And, the more that the spotlight shines on some of these issues and the more that people turn away and say, nothing to see here, move on, the more we are convinced that this is actually a real significant issue. So we won't let up, and I don't think Bragg and the Senate will let up either.
No. Now, Martin, the other comment I just need to make here is that the chairman basically said, quote, ASIC entirely rejects that they are a weak corporate regulator. I mean, the problem with this complete rejection is that look, someone's got to tell ASIC the debate's over. The data is the data. It's your information. it says you're going backwards. You can't continue to say to the public, you're good, because no one thinks you are good. And so if I get to testify later this year about my report, I'm going to basically say this point. There is, we have a fundamental problem. The data are saying they're getting worse. ASIC's saying we're getting better and we're good. And the two propositions can't be true. And so how best to resolve this? I mean, to my mind, the only way to resolve it is the people who continue to deny the obvious, they've got to go. Because if we can't actually get on the same page and actually agree that the numbers are the numbers, how can the government, the parliament, and the public at large, how can we move forward as one if there is just something so fundamental as ASIC not willing to concede that their numbers are saying they're getting worse?
Yeah. Well, the first action required to make any substantive change is to recognize reality as it is, rather than as you prefer it to be. And so unless ASIC actually, steps up and recognizes the reality based on their numbers, just again, underscore, it's their numbers, not ours. We've just taken the information and represented it back. It shows you that there's a long, long way to go. And I suspect ultimately it'll have to be imposed on ASIC rather than actually them coming to the party on a, voluntary basis.
Martin, ASIC has had the opportunity over the last 9 months to explain why their data is producing the trends that it is. When I asked them in a closed-door meeting in September last year, why is your data showing these trends? They couldn't explain it. In their own submission to the inquiry, which is more than 50 pages, they had no explanation for the trends, and they've had more than 9 months to explain why they're doing fewer investigations. Why is the no further action rate going through the roof? Why are they only acting on 9% of whistleblower disclosures or whistleblower complaints? They have no explanation for these trends and these performance outcomes. And the fact that they can't explain their own numbers, I mean, that just screams massive incompetency.
I agree, John. And the more they try and say there's nothing to see here in the light of the data, the worse it gets. And by the way, if you're a fraudster or, in the financial sector, you can breathe easy because clearly you can get away with
it. Totally. I mean, look, yes, you can get away with it. But also, even if you're not a fraudster, Martin, and you're thinking, what's my next career move? Well, ASIC is signaling maybe engage in corporate fraud because the chances you're going to get caught and put away, it's getting worse by the year. And ASIC is showing no sense that they're going to actually tackle fundamental financial crime in the country, which is so who knows, Martin, maybe when you come back to Australia, if you do come back, we have a new career path for you.
I'll pencil it in, John. I'll pencil it in. Well, let's move on and just briefly talk about the other important issue, because of course there's this thing called the Dorothy Dixer, which was a very important issue. And again, I think, well, it was a bit sliced, wasn't it?
Yes. So Martin, a few shows ago, you and I did a show called we did a show called ASIC Confesses to Political Collusion. And that was an important show because that came back, that was off the back of our show called about the Final Secret. And in the Final Secret, we said that there's potential collusion between the Prime Minister and the crooks during a criminal investigation. And then we followed up and said, well, we know that ASIC, the cops, are actually colluding with parliamentarians because I was able to get some documents through a Freedom of Information request. And ASIC is watching this show. So this topic of does ASIC collude with politicians to plant questions and rig parliamentary proceedings, that was brought up yesterday, and the response was quite stunning. So, but before we get into the clip of what ASIC actually said when Senator Bragg put this to them, is I just want to go back to what was actually the quote that was actually communicated in an email on the 6th of October. So this is the national media manager at ASIC called Gervais Green. And if we just bring up the second slide, again, I won't read the whole slide, but it basically says, quote, fact is, it is a negative story without a doubt. It really needs to be strongly and unequivocally refuted and countered at the next parliamentary hearing. Then it goes on to say, and as I discussed this with Warren, and this is Warren Day, the Chief Operating Officer, yesterday, that he was preparing and hoping for an opportunity to respond. Not my area, I know, but I suggested we arrange a Dorothy Dixer to make sure it's upfront and as early and loudly as possible. So, Martin, that's the context. That was what was said in the email on the 6th of October. So let's actually play the clip of what actually ASIC's response was when Senator Bragg asked about this topic.
There were some Freedom of Information documents provided recently which canvass some internal ASIC communications in relation to a release of a report on the way that ASIC handles complaints, where a communication from an ASIC official, Gervais Green, has quite suggested we arrange a Dorothy Dixer to make sure it's upfront and early, as loudly as possible, end quote, in an email to Zoe Valaris. Can you explain to me what exactly you mean by arranging a Dorothy Dixer?
I take it you're referring to an email from Gervais to Zoe.
Yep.
I think read in context, the question that Gervais was suggesting was a question that should be raised at the next available parliamentary hearing in order for that issue to be dealt with right at that parliamentary hearing. So that's how I read it when I was refreshed about this morning. Mr. Green works in the corporate comms area. He put that in an email, and that's not is what it is.
So which parliamentarian would be given this Dorothy Dixer?
Beg your pardon?
I'm just wondering would this be given to a federal parliamentarian, or how does it work?
Well, I'm not suggesting that this is a normal practice, but Mr. Savandra wants to say something.
Chair, as the email notes, it's not Mr. Green's job or role to engage with government or parliamentarians. I've inquired or spoken to Mr. Green. He's confirmed that he did not sort of approach any parliamentarian to ask a Dorothy Dixer, and it's certainly not ASIC's practice, as far as I'm aware, for ASIC to approach parliamentarians to ask questions. I think it can be taken on the face of the email that it's a throwaway line, and he clearly states quite explicitly in the email that it's not a matter for him.
Okay. So ASIC doesn't try and provide Dorothy Dixer questions to members of Parliament?
That's correct.
Senator, but to be clear, we do engage in response to parliamentarians, including parliamentarians that sit on committees, about issues that they are interested in. Sometimes they are about matters which are raised with us through various committees, the PJC and the like. But certainly it is not our practice, as I said previously, to plant or ask parliamentarians to ask us Dorothy Dixers.
Okay.
Yeah, and John, it's worth saying, of course, that this came out through the FOI that you actually initiated. So, you know, your activity has created this conversation. And, well, are they sort of saying nothing to see here again?
Well, yeah, I mean, there was a few things that ASIC said that was just, it blew my mind. The first thing he said, like the first thing they said was, you have to listen, you have to read this notion of the Dorothy Dixer. You have to read it in context. So what's the context? We just went through the slide. ASIC is getting smashed to the national media because of my report, and they want to kill a media story. They don't want to actually fix the problem. They don't want to actually read the report and go through the numbers and make sure whether I was accurate or not. They don't want to actually serve the public. They just want to stop the bad press. That is the context of this. So when they said you got to read this in context, the context is bad. The context is, they're involved in spin. They want to stop the bad press coming towards them by pushing back with their own propaganda. I mean, that's the context. But then you see that Chairman Longo goes, he said, quote, "It is what it is." Well, I'm just stunned that someone who's on $800,000 a year, has the temerity to actually say that it is what it is. Well, Martin, when you see someone of that sort of stature and that on a person on that sort of money, who says, "Well, we don't engage in rigging Parliament," but then he says it is what it is. How did you take that statement?
Well, they're trying to downplay it, and of course, a bit later they said it was a throwaway line and wasn't important, But it is what it is. Exactly right. You can see what it is. It was an attempt to try and influence Parliament by throwing a question in the right place at the right time to offset bad publicity.
Yeah, that was kind of like in terms of my reaction. So you have a senior manager and ASIC says that the way we're going to kill this bad press story is not actually improve our performance. We're going to actually collude with a politician or a mole inside Parliament, and we're actually going to rig parliamentary proceedings. So when Longo says it is what it is, my first concern is, why isn't he concerned? If I was running ASIC and someone was suggesting we're going to do something improper, that something we don't do as a matter of our natural, in terms of our natural operations, I would be saying, well, I'm highly alarmed that this person would even put it in writing, let alone say it verbally. So I was just completely dismayed that Longo said it is what it is, because it looks bad. It looks very bad for ASIC, and his whole attitude to this, didn't show the level of concern that he should have shown. And to me, the reason why he said it is what it is, because, like you said, they do this. This is part of their tactics. It's very interesting, Martin, that at the beginning, during the course of the hearing, there was this issue of releasing ASIC's confidential case files on closed cases, because Senator Bragg wants to look at some of these old investigations to figure out how does ASIC investigate and whether they're actually doing a good job or not, and what's the methodology. And what did Chairman Longo say? We can't show you our files because that's going to reveal our methods. And if the public knew our methods, we would become less effective regulators. Well, my attitude to this is that one of their methods that they don't want the public to know is that they actually do rig parliamentary proceedings with Dorothy Dixers. And so when you see, you had the General Counsel say that he spoke to Mr. Green, and Mr. Green did not contact a government or Parliament. Well, Mr. Green in the email said he wasn't going to do it. He said, let's ASIC, let's arrange it. Let's get someone else to do it. So he never said he was going to do it himself. So that was just a complete BS line by that. But then he said, it's not our approach. Well, so hang on. So if it's not your approach, why did he put it in the email? You don't necessarily suggest these things that come out of left field. The fact that this was put in an email and they say it's a throwaway line. No, someone gave this guy an idea to actually arrange a Dorothy Dixer. I would love for the inquiry to call Mr. Green and say, if this is not how ASIC does business, why did you put in writing? Who gave you this idea to rig Parliament? How often do you discuss this inside the office? Because if he comes out and says, "Oh, look, I just came up with this idea and no one told me, we've never discussed it before," who's going to believe that? That's just not a credible answer at all.
I agree, and it goes to form. And I'm afraid that influencing behind the scenes and pushing people in the right direction is very much part of what they do. They don't want to reveal their methods, but actually their methods are there in transparency for people to see.
Well, Martin, I have to say that in the last 2 months, I've really embraced the freedom of information process. Funny enough, it was only only under my first FOI request was only April this year. So given that the inquiry has been running a little bit slower, I thought to myself, well, what else can I do? And I thought, well, I've never actually engaged in the freedom of information process. And so I've been flooding the entire federal government with a whole host of FOI requests seeking various records and various things. And it has delivered some interesting result, which has obviously given us an insight into not only what they do inside ASIC, but how they think. And how they think is quite disturbing. And again, it's a major victory for financial criminals, because if you're a financial criminal and you can see what their attitude is inside the agency, it's going to give you confidence that your ability to continue these crimes, who's really going to come out of ASIC aggressively to enforce the law and put people in jail. The whole mentality of ASIC is denial, it's spin, it's propaganda, and you're not going to be able to objectively enforce the law and get good outcomes if that's the whole culture of ASIC.
Yes, absolutely. Well, we continue to see them playing to form as expected. And I guess the longer this journey goes on, the more we're going to see those same behaviours. But of course, it's not going to solve the underlying issue, which hopefully the Senate inquiry will push hard at. And, well, it's a critical issue that has to be resolved, because without it, financial crime will continue to become an ever more dominant feature of the Australian economy. And that's not good for anybody.
Absolutely. So Martin, in conclusion, I just want to focus on a couple of themes. So who won out of yesterday? The criminals. The criminals saw yesterday and they thought, obviously, ASIC's not going to fix itself, and they don't want to even have an honest discussion about how poorly they have been performing. And then obviously, despite the overwhelming evidence, their whole political strategy between now and when the inquiry finishes is to deny Adams is crazy, forget that Wollongong bogan. Martin North is so embarrassed by Adams, he had to leave the country and go to England. Forget North as well. Bragg's making irrational statements in the Senate without evidence. We're just going to carry on doing what we do and to hell with everyone else. I mean, that's going to be their attitude. The only last point I'll leave you with, Martin, is that it's clear to me that the softly approach with ASIC is not going to work, because they're not willing to meet the Senate halfway. So to those who are listening and were perhaps slightly frustrated with the tenor of yesterday's examination of ASIC, the only thing I can urge people to do is to email committee members and tell them that the public wants a more aggressive approach. People want the Parliament to put ASIC's feet to the fire and really hit home on some of these issues and to get them to answer real questions, and if they don't have the answer, to expose their lack of knowledge in certain areas. So I think if people want real change, and like Senator Bragg says, once in a generation or once in a 10-year shot of actually moving the needle with ASIC, given that this is a 15-year disaster in the making, given the attitude of Longo and his entourage, it really has to be a super aggressive approach, not just in terms of report writing, and obviously the interim report's important, but in terms of some of these public hearings, the senators have to really be very assertive. And we've seen over the last 30 years a number of senators who have had that ability to really push bureaucrats. If you go back to the 1980s, you had Senators Faulkner and Robert Ray, and then in recent time with the coalition, you had Senators Brandis, Cormann, Fifield, some of these people who were around 10 years ago, who I got to work with when I was in Parliament 10 years ago. Strong personalities, whether they're working for the right side of politics or the left side of politics, play a useful role to hold bureaucrats and the deep state to account. And that's what I think to some degree the Senate is lacking. And we just have to, I guess, give senators more confidence that they should become more aggressive and more assertive, and not feel constrained to actually pursue the public interest.
Absolutely. Well, I guess, John, our role here is to continue to cast that spotlight into the situation, but also to provide support where we can to the senators and say, you are pushing on the right issues. This is a really critical issue. Don't let anything stop you from actually getting to the resolution that must be there, required, of course, for the interests of the people.
Yes. I'll just leave you with one thought, Martin, is when you refer to our role, there are more surprises to come. So our role has not concluded yet.
We'll leave that hanging, John. Look forward to the next one. Martin North, John Adams, in the interest of the people. We'll see you next time.